Well, hi there. This is Scott Langford, and I am a professor of English at Foothill College in Silicon Valley Bay Area. I'm here to welcome a former Foothill student, now a postdoc fellow at USC, Viola Lasmana, and I'll be saying a little bit more about Viola and then asking her to update us on what's happened since she left Foothill College. So first up, Viola, welcome back to Foothill College virtually.
Thank you so much, Scott. So happy to be here.
So happy to have you. It's so exciting. It's so exciting for me. And I can't tell you how pleased I am to have you back. I think we've both been looking forward to this moment for about 20 years. Um, just, just some quick notes on Viola's progress, and I'm going to ask her to tell us more about how this all happened. So when I last saw her in person, she was a student at Foothill College in one of my classes, and we were reminiscing, and that was a few years ago. I've been teaching at Foothill for 30 years. It certainly wasn't that long. And then she went on to earn English degrees at USF, University of San Francisco, and San Francisco State University. She got her master's degree. Then she transferred over to, then she went to get her Ph.D. At USC down in Southern California, where she's been ever since. And then currently she's a postdoctoral fellow in American Studies and Ethnicity. And that's partly what she's going to talk to us about. Some of her specialties include contemporary film, and that's one of the things that my students are reading about. And just before I kind of turn over to you, Viola, I'll mention to everyone, if you want to ask a question, please do it in the chat room. I have two co-hosts, Jubin and Chris, who are here with me. They'll be monitoring the chat room for your questions. If you put a double question mark there, that'll help a lot. We will get to questions as soon as we can, but first we want to kind of catch up on what's up with Viola. And I will also mention that my students had homework, but not everyone did. So since some of you are joining us, we'll try to mention the reading and the film and bring you up to date quickly. But for my own students, that was your homework, and we'll try to get to your questions about Viola's response to the film Kelly Loves Tony, which we all viewed, the 1998 film. And so at this point, Viola, I'm gonna ask you, so wow, what happened after you left Foothill College?
Wow, okay. So where do I even start? I mean, so when we were catching up in the green room earlier, I was telling Scott how excited and happy I was and super honored to be invited back to Foothill College. For me, it feels like it's come full circle. You know, Foothill College was where I consider it the where it all began for me as far as my academic career goes, you know, and Scott, and I'll speak to this a little bit more later, but Scott has been somebody who's been a huge influence in my career, and without him, I don't believe that, you know, it would have been a very different trajectory for me. So, you know, I know that, you know, I haven't met all of you here. I have a couple of friends here, Will and Edward. And Edward is also a Foothill alum. So very happy to have fellow Foothill alum here in the room. But I was hoping, I actually just wanted to begin by saying that I know that the Zoom platform can be quite tiring sometimes as far as the technological platform goes. And so I'll try to make this as conversational as possible. I hope I won't talk at you too much. So if you want to jump in as I'm talking about something, please do raise your hand. Feel free to jump in and make a comment or ask questions. But I do want to, so a couple of things that I'll do today is share a little bit about myself, my background, you know, what I did at Foothill and beyond. And then we can talk about Kelly Loves Tony, because that's my most recently published written piece. Pretty recent, just came out I think in the last like month or so. So I thought that would be a good thing to read together, to see together. Also because Spencer Nagasako, the filmmaker, is based in the Bay Area and has been doing work with a lot of Bay Area youth for many years now. So should I can I share my screen now, Scott, to just...
Yeah, sure. Anytime you want. You're in charge unless you want help from us. So go right ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I put together a bunch of slides, and so I'll go through them and see where the conversation goes. As I said, hopefully I can make this as conversational as possible. But okay, so I just wanted to say again, thank you, and what a great lineup. I saw the lineup of the various speakers that you have for the API Heritage Month, and I'm so honored to be part of the lineup.
Yeah, well, in fact, while you work on your screen sharing, I'll mention that the other guests that we have this week, we're coming to the end of what for my class has been 6 amazing speakers. But it was interesting to me that since you chose the discussion about Kelly Loves Tony, that there's a connection, of course, in the Mien diaspora coming out of Laos and etc. as refugees from the Vietnam War, which spilled over tragically and completely illegally into the United States. So on Thursday, we're going to be joining live from Saigon, author Andrew Lam, another Bay Area author who's recently relocated back to Saigon, and he will be joining us on April 30th, which is the exact 45th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, which is what we call it over here on this side of the Pacific Pond. So it's very fascinating that we have this Vietnam War tie-in, and that this was the particular part of your work that you chose for us. It was a great, and accidental, I must say, but a great tie-in for us. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for the reminder. Yeah, one of my students also talked about that, you know, the commemoration of the Black April, as they call it, some people call it. So you're right in that this seems like it's a nice kind of accidental thing, but it's serendipitous, but it's actually also very much a part of, I consider, a part of how I came to understand my own experience coming into the Asian American identity, because I never really used to identify as one, because as Scott mentioned, I came as an international student, but I can talk about that a little bit more later. So just a little bit about me, just so you know where I'm from and sort of my background, and because I think these are all important parts to, you know, some personal and the professional for me are always interconnected. So let me begin by sharing with you where I'm from. So I'm from Bogor, Indonesia. That's where I spent the first 8 years of my life. And then I spent a good number of years in Singapore in primary secondary school education. So my adolescent years were spent in Singapore. And so from there, you know, I had this whole transpacific journey, you know, across the ocean to San Francisco, where I first came in 2000. Which is, as I said, this is where it all began for me at Foothill College in 2000. I arrived as an international student, and since then, I've since been naturalized as an American citizen. So questions of like citizenship and belonging are always questions that are in the back of my head. So at Foothill, I actually didn't get my associate's degree, but I did complete these certificates in American literature, British literature, and written communication. I'm not sure if they still have these certificate programs because it's such a long time ago, Scott, so I don't know. It's been like 20 years, so.
The answer is, well, kind of. And what we didn't have back then, students, was these associate degrees for transfer. So more students now get an associate's degree prior to transfer than in the old days, and that's an improvement, right? Because we used to not get those degrees as easily and as smoothly. So go ahead though.
Mm-hmm. And so this was, you know, putting together these slides was really fun for me because it made me kind of reflect on what I did when I first came. And so one of the things that I have really fond memories of too is I worked as a peer tutor at the Teaching and Learning Center. And this is for me like one of the highlights of being at a community college, right? It's for me, community college experience is really valuable because you have such diverse student population. It's a very robust kind of diverse experience in terms of not just race, ethnicity, class, but also age, right? And so when I was a peer tutor, I mean, I wasn't an adult yet, you know, in terms of age, but I was teaching this Peruvian woman who needed help in conversational English. So that was a really wonderful experience where I got to have this relationship with this, at the time, considerably older woman from Peru. And so in terms of intercultural relationships and just getting to know somebody from a very different background than I knew, that was part of what made being in a community college also very, very rich. So big shout out to Scott Langford. His mentorship and support and teaching. I mean, this is immense for me. And as somebody who's come up in the academic world as a woman of color professor and scholar, I cannot underscore the importance of having support from faculty, from mentors, because it can carry you so far. And when we were catching up in the green room, Scott was saying he remembers me as being quite outspoken in class, which I find quite surprising now thinking back, because I remember actually being quite afraid of the college classroom, in which, especially the American college classroom, in which everyone is so, it felt like a lot of people were very ready to speak up, right? And I felt like there was a huge culture shock for me. So I think that speaks to your pedagogical, really being able to open up those spaces for students like me, Scott, who was still trying to figure out ways to be in a college classroom, in an academic classroom. So for me, it's been a long journey, 20 years ago to now, teaching college students. And I think, I'm very much indebted to this very early years in which Scott, in the literature classes, where I was able to pursue my passion in literature, write, but also have the support, which is something that shouldn't be underestimated, like the kind of importance of that. So yes.
Well, and I'll jump in and say, Viola, that the writing assignment for the students in the class this time is specifically about finding your voice, right? So we're listening to a series of 6 speakers, and we're reading a charming how to write book called Shut Up and Write. And so their job, in essence, is to begin finding their voice. And so I do think part of what I remember is that you really did find your voice in that class. So if I think you might be accurate that you started out a little bit shy and reticent, but by the end, you were amazing us. And that's one reason that I still remember you quite vividly some 20 years later. Kind of amazing. And thank you for the thank you. I didn't know that was coming, but I did want to say that this is why we're doing what we're doing in this class. Like, this is the point of the assignment that you have. And you don't all have to become university professors at USC, although I wouldn't mind. But finding your voice is a really big deal in the world. And it's also what you study. That's what I think is so interesting, Viola, right? Like, that's what the film's about, that you had us watch, for example, right? Kelly is finding herself against all odds. And so I'll throw that in there too. Back to you and your slides.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I think it's a great movie to watch, especially for college students too, trying to find their footing in the world. But to your point, Scott, about finding your voice, I think, that's a really great thing, to be able to find your voice, but also just to reinforce again the fact that it's not only about finding your voice, because nobody is voiceless, right? Everybody has a voice. It's just a matter of whether you're heard or you have the space to put your voice out there. And so that's what I think professors, like you have given students like me, is being able to create those spaces to make your voices be heard. So great. So post Foothill, I remained in the Bay Area for quite some time. I transferred to University of San Francisco so I got my BA in English. So my academic career has all been English literature. So been pretty true to that. And when I was pursuing my master's in English at San Francisco State University, I just, you'll notice that there's some gaps in the years. So after my BA, 2004, I didn't actually go to San Francisco State until 3 years later. And so this is something to consider if for those of you who are thinking of, kind of your next steps forward. I just felt like I needed to, I don't know, grow into my own a little bit more. So I worked kind of in a non-academic setting as an education services coordinator while pursuing the master's degree. So that was something that I actually really grateful that I had the chance to do, because it allowed me to mature into my own before pursuing very seriously a PhD and an academic career.
Yeah, and I'll jump in one more time for a little. I do my little Foothill ads. Essentially, we still have a very warm, wonderful relationship with University of San Francisco. And for those of you that are newer students, we have an amazing Mellon Humanities Fellows program that has very large scholarship opportunities and intensive mentoring and tutoring. So it's just like, so I go to conferences at USF on a regular basis. In fact, I would have physically been going to a conference this month with USF professors and community college professors and presenting. So that has continued. And of course, we also have a huge relationship with San Francisco State. It's our number 1 or number 2 transfer destination. And we kicked off API Heritage Month in my class with interviewing Professor Mei-Li Chai, who teaches in creative writing. So that's just my little Foothill ad. Mm-hmm. But following in Viola's footsteps those doors are still open for those of you that might be interested in either of those two amazing and powerful schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it's really important to have when I was an undergrad, I didn't know much about foundations, institutions like the Mellon Foundation, for instance, right, which has so much resources in terms of scholarships for students. And I was actually a recipient of Mellon Humanities, Digital Humanities Fellowship when I was at USC. Oh. So that was really, really great too. I think I saw, did I see a hand up?
Hi.
Oh, it's Jamie, okay.
Hi, Viola, thank you for being with us today. I love hearing your story, and especially Foothill alumni, because we are in a similar boat. But I'm also an English major. I just have a question about your PhD studies. Mm-hmm. And my interpretation of like master's degrees and like beyond that, like for some reason it always seems like it's like a 2-year program or like shorter. So like, why are you in your PhD program for over 5 years?
Viola and I are both laughing because 2 years is definitely in air quotes these days. Go ahead, Viola.
Well, as far as the master's degree goes, I think you can finish a master's in humanities. So English is humanities. You can probably finish a master's within 2 years. I was a part-time master's student, so it took me about 3 years. As far as the PhD goes, oh boy, where do I even begin? So humanities fields do take a lot longer than other majors, other fields. Because it takes a long time to do your research and to finish like a book-length dissertation, which is what the current project that I'm working on is based on the dissertation that I completed, and it's a book length, right? So it does take a long time to finish that work. So it could range between, I would say, like if somebody can finish their PhD these days in the humanities within 5 years, like that's pretty quick. Wouldn't you say so, Scott? Like that's a pretty good, like that.
Oh yeah, that's actually quite quick. And there's not as many jobs as there have been before too. So there's also a kind of like, you really need to keep polishing your work and your curriculum vitae with the academic resume, building up your teaching experience. That's why these postdoctoral fellowships, like the one that Viola has, are really wonderful and useful. And I had one of those too. Viola, I don't know if you know, I tell students, I was in college I was from freshman to from being a freshman in college as an undergrad to completing my PhD was longer than K through 12. And that includes a couple years off, but I spent 14 years in college and grad school total, if you add in the extra years, which is why my family said, why one of the kids in my family says, Dr. Scott, you must have been, oh, Uncle Scott, you spent 14 years in college? You must be really stupid. So back to you, Viola.
Yeah, I know. My family for a long time were like, when are you going to get out of school? Like, what, you know, when are you going to get a real job? But so the other layer of this that that I think everyone should know before, you know, making decisions about grad school and things like that, if you're serious about it, is the question of support in terms of financial support, like the scholarship or fellowship that you might be getting, as well as faculty support, because those will impact your ability to finish the PhD very, very seriously. I have colleagues, it's very common for people to drop out of PhD programs. One, because there simply isn't enough support in terms of like funding, and so you'd have to balance being a teaching assistant while still having to do your own research, right? So that takes a toll on you, having to teach and mentor, but also do this work to finish your degree. So that's one layer. The other layer is very, very important, which is the funding. Without a proper stipend, fellowship, you won't be able, it's hard to maintain a way of living, right? Because we're human beings. We need to maintain a certain standard of living to remain sane and to remain being able to just live like a normal person, right? Like, and you think about these days now with unemployment rates on the rise. So it's a real thing. So I'll just be completely transparent here, but when I chose to go to USC, it wasn't just because, okay, USC is very well connected, has all these like programs that I wanted to tap into, but also because they offered the most amount of money. So I thought, okay, so this is where I can be supported financially while still have enough time for my own research. And that's a really important consideration, because it will impact the amount of time. With that said, even though I had a really good fellowship and TA-ship while at USC, which was very balanced, I also received the extra 2 years with the Mellon Foundation with the Digital Humanities Fellowship. So I took that, and I just took the extra time because I don't know if you've heard about this, but it's very hard for English PhDs to get jobs these days after the PhD. There are just not enough jobs for everyone, for people across, I think it's across different kinds of university jobs, even community college jobs too are very, very competitive. So it's a tough world out there. So so that's my kind of long answer to your question. I don't know if that answers your question, or if you have more.
It does, and I really appreciate how you, Dr. Viola Lasmana, and Dr. Scott Lanford are still like willing to go through that process and continue to be expressive artists, because, you know, I've definitely felt like a pressure, especially growing up in the Silicon Valleys, going to tech, going to all these other things, give that job security. But I know I would not be happy with it at all. So I just really appreciate you just explaining the reality behind that. And that, you know, you're just going to really have to make a decision to put yourself out there all the way, because that's your job when you're in that position. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and say two things here. One, rolling the tape backward. I mean, I was mentored by professors of color at Stanford, Arturo Islas, for example, who then passed away from AIDS, which was quite tragic in my life. But I owe so much to the people that mentored me, and I think there's this kind of carrying the torch forward. So it's very moving for me that Viola is now going to step forward to be a professor herself. And I also sort of rolling the tape forward. And since it's API Heritage Month, you know, one of the most celebrated and accomplished Asian American authors, just American literature authors on the planet, Viet Thanh Nguyen, is connected with USC, and I think Viola, you did some work with him. And so that's where these sort of often elitist universities at the graduate school level, that's often where they do the most for you, if you can make those contacts. And I definitely did get that from my Stanford education, which I'm grateful for. And I think Viola has also benefited from that as well. So you're in many ways, USC was exactly the right place to do the kind of work that you wanted to do based on what I know about USC faculty.
Yeah, so Viet Thanh Nguyen, who most of you might know as the Pulitzer Prize winning novelist for The Sympathizer. He then went on to write short stories, Refugees. So he was my dissertation chair. And so it has a lot to do with, he has supported me very, very immensely too. So having that support, I just cannot overstate. And that's why for me, like going back to where it all began, Foothill, I mean, it's you can't just have support towards the end of your career, right? It has to, the seeds have to already be there. So especially as a person of color, as a woman, being able to tap into these faculty support and being supported that way, even when you didn't know perhaps that you needed the support, has been very, very life-changing for me.
Yeah, that echoes for me too. Like they helped me before I knew that I wanted help. Like they sort of saw something in me that was not visible to me. And I'm eternally grateful for that. And I should also mention that Viet Thanh Nguyen is a local Bay Area kid, right? Like grew up in San Jose. His family knows our president, Foothill College president, Nguyen's family. So like the epicenter of so much of Asian Pacific Islander literature in the United States, which has changed American literature forever and deeply. The epicenter is, and always has been, here in California. And it's not like there's not writers from other states. But so many of the most celebrated professors and authors, especially in the early days, were coming out of the Bay Area, and that gets us back to the film too, right? Because the films were also coming out of the Bay Area as well. So not a bad time to mention that Wayne Wang, who was the first celebrated Asian American director, was also a Foothill College student. As well as Edward Ganawan, who's gone on to have a film career, who's in the Zoom room with us now. So on the film side, there's also been this amazing Foothill history, Bay Area history, a legacy of people breaking through glass ceilings and getting their voice out there in ways that is absolutely stunning. And it's, I think we were all, I don't know what your opinion of Crazy Rich Asians was, Viola. I should probably look up whatever you wrote about it. But at least, I mean, it had been 20 years since the last major Hollywood film. And that last major Hollywood film was based on a book by a Bay Area writer, Amy Tan, and made by Wayne Wang, who went to Foothill College, right? And then there was this 20-year silence, which is embarrassing and horrifying, but still, we're still breaking through these glass ceilings, but a lot of the hammers that are hitting the glass are coming right from your own hometown.
I did not know that Wayne Wang went to Foothill College.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
He was actually one of the very first international students at Foothill College way back in the late 60s, amazingly enough, right?
Yeah.
So he was a pathfinder in every conceivable way. And he is, and I, again, like you, I don't think he got an AA degree from Foothill College, but we have honored him. And I actually keep trying to get him back to have a Zoom chat or something. Haven't managed that one yet.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And
isn't that amazing? Yeah, like what a legacy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in good company with, Foothill College has so many amazing alums. So, but you mentioned Crazy Rich Asians and the 20-some years of there's kind of this gap for Asian American mainstream Hollywood films, right? So one of the things that I really love about the independent Asian American independent filmmaking is that before Crazy Rich Asians, Crazy Rich Asians and then The Farewell, right? You have this kind of resurgence of Asian American representation. But even before all of that, it's important to kind of recover these films, like it wasn't that there was no Asian American film or media or representation. It's just that they weren't being circulated in a way that high production films like Crazy Rich Asians would. These are independent films that get supported in different ways and have very different motivations, very different roots. These are more kind of, I would consider them more kind of activist, more socially centered. So it's a very different kind of filmmaking. So that's one of the goals of why I wanted to write about Spencer Nakasago's films, is because there is a trajectory of Asian American film and media that had very activist roots from the 70s onward. And I think the mainstream American society probably think, oh, there was Drama Club and then there was Crazy Rich Asians, right? When in between all of that, you have actually these very activist films. So, okay, so I just wanted to mention a little bit about my teaching experience. This was also nice for me to reflect on, but just I just thought this might be useful too in terms of thinking about, well, my work is very interdisciplinary, so I teach at different departments. I had an interest in video making, like amateur videos. I'm not by any means a professional video maker at all, but so early on, so this was 12 years ago, I taught a video production class for a Jumpstart summer program at Skyline College, another local Bay Area college. And then I was a TA at San Francisco State for literature courses. And so when I was doing my PhD at USC, I taught courses in rhetoric and composition, and I also taught classes on digital media. And so at the moment, I've been teaching as an adjunct also at Occidental College at Media Arts and Culture, where I teach film and global media. And my main appointment is at USC in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity, where I teach primarily courses in Asian American literature, film, media, and I've also taught courses in just kind of the broader American studies related topics and also popular culture. Okay, so yes, Scott, did you want to say something? Okay.
Oh, no, I'm just, I am really proud that you're also, of course, also a teacher, and that you have taught both at universities, at major universities and in community college settings. And I love that. I love that too. So I love that you have become an accomplished teacher in your own right as well. And it shows in your very smooth Zoom presentations, by the way. So there we go.
Well, this is, tomorrow will be my last time teaching on Zoom for, the semester. It's, as you are beginning the spring semester, or just in the kind of beginning few weeks, I'm actually ending the semester here at USC. We're in our last week of classes.
Yeah, and I might also note, because students don't always recognize these terms, that when you're teaching rhetoric and composition, that means you're teaching a class almost exactly like English 1C honors. So another way to talk about the class that most of the students on the Zoom room today are taking what is essentially what would be called a rhetoric and composition course at some other colleges, which just basically means writing and communication in nice fancy language.
Okay, so I don't know if there's any other questions in regards to kind of that career trajectory. But my next slide is transition over to the material for today, which is, as I said, it's my most recently written piece. It's an article about Spencer Nakasago, who's the filmmaker. He's a Japanese-American filmmaker, and he had been working with Southeast Asian American youth in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Tenderloin area, and also East Bay for like 20 years in 80s and 90s, almost 20 years. So he spent a lot of time like just making the commitment to work with them. So this is the journal that it was published in. It's a special issue on Asian American film at 50, as they call it, because it's marking the anniversaries of of the 40th and 50th anniversaries of organizations like Visual Communications, which is based in LA, which produces Asian American media, and also the 50th anniversary of Asian American Studies Center at UCLA. I was actually supposed to be part of a panel at the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA when was that? Like back in March, in mid-March, and then the pandemic happened. So that was canceled. We might have something virtual, but there was supposed to be sort of a panel celebrating this issue. But then the pandemic happened. Okay, so the film that I shared with you for today, Kelly Loves Tony, that was actually the second of the series here, which is called loosely called the Refugee Trilogy. The first one was AKA Dawn Bonus, 1995, and then Kelly Loves Tony, and then Refugee. AKA Dawn Bonus was set in San Francisco, Tenderloin area, and actually, it's funny because we talk about these like anniversaries, 20th year, and Kelly Loves Tony is also, I mean, right around the time when right before I went to the US, actually, right before I arrived in the United States. So the timing of all of this is pretty serendipitous, I would say. So as I said, like this work, the Refugee Trilogy, it emerged from his maybe about 17 or 18 years with Southeast Asian American youth, in particular refugee youth in the Tenderloin area of San Francisco and the East Bay Asian Youth Center. And another work of his that came out in the 90s was called Tenderloin Stories, which was, I think, a compilation of 4 short videos. Okay, so let me just say something about the first film, AKA Dawn Bonus. So this one was about, Sokli Ni, AKA Dawn Bonus, so he gave himself this nickname, Dawn Bonus. He was from Cambodia. He came as a refugee, and this one is the most talked about film of the Refugee Trilogy. It won the National Emmy Award, so this one was a very significant film, and has gotten a lot of write-ups, and this is the most written about film of Spencer Nakasako's Refugee Trilogy. Kelly Loves Tony is kind of the anomaly of the trilogy, I would say, because it actually has, it actually centers on the experience of mainly Kelly. I mean, it is from the point of view of Kelly and Tony, but it is the only film out of the 3 Refugee Trilogy that focuses on the experience of this young Southeast Asian woman coming of age, just becoming a new mother, trying to figure out, you know, her next steps, wanting to go to college, wanting to achieve the American dream, but then also having to deal with the very fraught history of being a refugee and all the things that come with it, which is lack of access to good education, right, support, and all of that. So for those of you who saw the film, so these two the subjects of this film, Kelly and Tony, so they met in high school, and Kelly is this kind of smart and you know, very dynamic person, having a lot of goals in her life, wanting to make it in the world. And Tony is her boyfriend, also the person that she has a baby with, and he is somebody who is facing a deportation case. If you saw the film, he's facing deportation. He eventually won the case. So one of the things that I wanted to mention too is that this film is also very important to reconsider now, given the current immigration policies under the Trump administration, the current administration, and with the numerous immigration bans, and also the fact that these, the refugees from the Vietnam War, a lot of them have also not only are facing the threat of being deported if they have any kind of criminal offenses, but some of them have already been deported. So it's not only just a threat, but it's already a reality now. So it makes me actually wonder if this film was made today, if Tony was facing this case today, I mean, I think ostensibly he would be possibly deported under the current administration.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and say, just to echo that point, Viola, in your piece, you wrote about the fact that it felt just incredibly contemporary, as if it had been made this year. And when I was watching the film, I could agree in so many ways. This being the one that comes to mind first, of course, is that he's in this deportation process. But just in so many other ways, this film, I don't know if you could have figured out when it was made. I mean, there's probably some technological cues in there, but honestly, I think I would have failed the pop quiz. If you said, when was this film made? I probably would have told you it was in the last 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, because the deportation crisis is so front and center now. Less so in 1998, but this is a long story. And as you know, as somebody who studies this, it's actually a centuries-long story here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And well, I put this quote here by Kelly. She repeats this a few times in the film. I don't know if you remember it, but what I love about this film too is no matter the challenges, there is a sense of and a feeling of resilience, you know, and she says, you know, I can't change the past, but I could always change the future. So there's this feeling of hope and resilience still there. And I really like that about the different layers of the film too. Okay, so I thought, given that not everyone here has seen the film, right? So I actually think I'm going to play this short trailer of the film. Sorry, let me see if I can get this to work. And you'll also get to hear from Spencer Nakasako himself too, the collaborator, director, producer of this film. So I think this might be a good one to see. So let me just play this, and hopefully you can all hear this and see it without a lag. Oh. Okay.
They're from opposite sides of the tracks. Kelly's a good girl and Tony's a bad guy.
I knew that he used to be in a gang or whatever, and I felt kind of insecure about that, you know?
Kelly told me that she kept a written diary. And so when I first met her, I said, well, this is almost the same thing, except that it can be a video diary. She got that concept like that.
I'm just like all of a sudden experiencing all kind of stuff, you know, being a wife, being a daughter-in-law.
What I was struck by was their frankness, their openness. They're willing to just, in a very simple way, just tell their story.
I'm getting camera shy.
They're very much products of the Vietnam War. The 1.5 generation, which is basically, you know, younger people who are born in a foreign country and raised in America. And they grow up extremely, extremely American.
I want a big house. I want to make a lot of money.
I see them sort of negotiating between their Mien side and, on the other hand, their American side. I was very much intrigued with what brought them together. You know, just that as a starting point, and then following that whole story through in terms of, you know, are they going to make it?
Okay, so I think that's a pretty good, you know, encapsulation of the film in general. And what I'll say about it is, I'm glad you mentioned Crazy Rich Asians earlier, Scott, because one of the things that I find very, very important about this film is that it gives it gives a representation of Asian American experience that is different, right? You think of there's the so-called model minority myth that's associated with Asian Americans, and how, oh, there's, you know, Asian Americans, they succeed in academics, they're, you know, they do really well. And there's this kind of upward mobility for Asian Americans, and that's kind of the narrative that's been given to the society by primarily for political reasons. But, so this idea that, Asian American experience has traditionally been focused on like East Asian Americans, like Chinese, Japanese. But then you have it after the Vietnam War, a wave of refugees that came to the United States right after the war. And so you have this group of people who are kind of outside of that narrative of like, model minority, you're going to succeed in life, like you have this upward mobility. That's not the case for these Southeast Asian American refugees, because it's often a very hard thing for them to overcome. Refugees are not like immigrants, where immigrants, the very word immigrant means that you move to a different country for reasons such as maybe business, maybe education, and maybe for work. But as far as being a refugee goes, the word refugee means that you have been forced to flee from some kind of extenuating circumstance, and in this case, like war, right? So that distinction has to be made, and I think this is a very important part of the not just Asian American experience. It has to be just underlined, because it hasn't been part of the more mainstream Asian American conversation, but also the American experience, because this is very much wound up with what the United States did in Southeast Asia during this time, and kind of the consequences that came with it.
Yeah, and Viola, let me jump in a little. One thing, I think you might have turned down your volume a little for the movie playback, and now you need to turn it back up.
Sorry, okay.
And you might also want to either advance the slide or unscreen share just for a minute, because the background isn't very exciting at the moment. And then speaking of background, I wanted to echo what you just said. In prior conversations in this series, a couple things we've emphasized is sort of like the model minority myth and how disempowering it is in many ways. And also the fact that so much of what's traditionally called API Heritage Months and Asian, quote unquote, Asian identity or Asian American identity is focused on sort of nation state identity. So Japanese, Chinese, Indonesian. Whereas in this case, the Mien community it's a diaspora. It's a significant diaspora, but it's a stateless diaspora. And from, in this case, the nation of Laos, upon which we secretly are, in other words, the United States, completely secretly I'm old enough to remember, like no one knew we were doing this outside the military, the Pentagon, and the State Department, and the White House. We poured more bombs down on that country than in that little time, that relatively tiny country absorbed more bombs than any country in the history of the world. We poured more bombs on them than we poured down on all of Europe through all of World War II. And this was done completely secretly and completely without the knowledge or consent of the American people or the Congress. That's not what President Nixon was impeached for, but in my opinion should have been. But then we got waves of refugees that people like me, again, I'd never heard of the Mien, I'd never heard of the Hmong. I don't think I could have found Laos on the map until it turns out that we're bombing the holy shit out of it. Sorry to use the S word, but like, it's just kind of a horrifying thing. So I love that this film not only focuses on Asian American identity, it focuses on a community that isn't as well known even now, but is a significant part of the Bay Area.
Yes, absolutely. And, so Scott, you said this war was secret, right, to the general American public at the time. And I think it remains, it's probably a lot more discussed and books have been published about it, but it remains secret for a long time. So it's the bombs that were dropped in Laos was called the secret war because the government didn't want the American people to know. And so one of the things that I always think about is, who is it secret to, right? Because when you think about the locals who have to experience the bombs and live with the consequences, which they continue to, because there are still bombs going off in different places because you can't really see them. right? And so who is it secret to when you call a certain war secret? It's not very secret to the people who are living there, right? And so that's one of the things too that I like to think about, like what's visible and not visible to the eye, and what's secret and what's not. Yes, so I also, I think it was a few years ago, how many years, maybe 3 years ago, let's see, for President Obama was the first president to actually visit Laos after,
right.
you know, after the Vietnam War. So, so it's a pretty recent piece of, you know, of history that remains present, even though it's been, you know, 50 years or so.
Well, and Laotian kids are still routinely maimed and killed by unexploded mines that we also drop in there, right? They're routinely born with hideous birth defects because of the Agent Orange that was poured down upon them. And again, speaking as a white American guy, like we really had no idea. They very successfully kept this war a secret from the general, quote unquote, general American populace. And just also I can remind my students, we had a very similar conversation with our very first guest, Professor Mei Li Chai from San Francisco State University. Remember that her whole journey into being a writer was being the only Asian American kid in this little tiny town in South Dakota until here comes a Cambodian family that opens a restaurant. Now, why is the Cambodian family there? Because we also bombed the living hell out of Cambodia. And they were that was a refugee family as well. And in the narrative, and in the real and then the fictionalized narrative, the woman who's the central character, her child had been killed by a mine while she was carrying the child across as fleeing as a refugee. So this is a long-standing theme in our class, in the literature of Asian America, and also just in the history of the Bay Area in particular.
Yeah, and if for those of you who managed to watch the film, you remember that Callie's father actually died in the Secret War, fighting for the CIA. So there's this great conundrum of, so you fought for the CIA, you died, but then your family become refugees, and but then gets displaced in such a violent way, violently taken out of your home, to then have to struggle in the United States, right? So, okay, let's see. Early on when we were beginning the conversation, I mentioned how choosing this film to discuss with all of you is also, to me, one of the ways that I come to understand my own experience as somebody who understood myself as Chinese Indonesian, but now have been naturalized as an American citizen. So I consider myself Indonesian American, right? But the Vietnam War legacy is also something that is very much connected to what happened in Indonesia around the same time. And that's what my PhD dissertation and research was focused on, which is the project I'm working on now, which is looking at the different kind of archives in the wake of the 1965 anti-communist genocide killings in Indonesia in 1965, which had to do with this theory of this Vietnam War and the domino theory of like communism is going to take over the world, right? And so there's this domino theory. It's called the domino theory because it's a theory that says if one country fell to communism, right? So if China falls to communism, then other countries in the surrounding will also fall to communism. And so what that meant for U.S. foreign policy was that you just start, killing anti-communist, killing communist sympathizers, people who were suspected communists. So in 1965 in Indonesia, something very similar happened. And that was some people now, a lot of scholars now refer to it as a genocide because there's an estimated like 1 million people may have been killed during that time, but it's the same, it's part of the same history. And And how I was relating it to my own kind of understanding of my experience is being an ethnic Chinese growing up in Indonesia. This was also part of my legacy, part of my personal history, because the ethnic Chinese were also part of the groups of people who were targeted during this time. And so this is also part of my own kind of personal family history growing up in Indonesia. And so this whole legacy of the Vietnam War, which really took over Southeast Asia, you know, is something that that I think also is part of my own understanding of myself. And yeah, so I think these are, you know, the interconnected histories of the countries in Southeast Asia that I wanted to highlight.
Well, and I want to add, again, you say this, but I want to say it louder. This genocide, 1 million people were killed brutally and systematically. So the word genocide is really very accurate, in this case on a political rather than mostly on an ethnic basis. But that genocide was clearly funded and supported by the US CIA. So we were not directly involved the way that we were militarily with Vietnam, or secretly with Laos and Cambodia. But there's no doubt that the CIA was supporting and funding and encouraging this anti-communist genocide. And that's why that domino theory slide is up there. So it's not like that happened without full US support and complicity, even though the fingerprints are not on it the way they are on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks for the clarification, Scott. And one thing that I'll just add to that, which I find really fascinating, is the Vietnam War. You think of it as, you know, kind of affecting these large countries, the more major countries. But what is really interesting to me is that part of the legacy of this war is that it actually was very much dependent on the smaller countries like Laos and Cambodia. And that's why it's really important to talk about this secret war and what happens after, because they actually had to take a lot of the brunt of the war. Right. So this is just something that I like to show when I'm talking about this. Is this is a New York Times article in the wake of the anti-communist genocide in Indonesia. It was written up as a successful, like, it's a gleam of light in Asia because the killings managed to be carried out. So this is one of the examples of, you know, the write-ups that you see happening in the age of, in the wake of the killings. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions so far or thoughts?
Chris, it looked like you wanted to say something. Do you want to jump in on this? I was seeing you in the chat room there.
Yeah, I'm also a fellow Chinese Indonesian American myself, and actually kind of acknowledging these kinds of hidden history in a way was something that's really important in like a lot of society, even in a class like this.
Well, and even at Foothill College, I'll mention, Viola, I think you were kind of at the end of there. We had a great wave of Chinese Indonesian students, and we still have quite a few Chinese Indonesian students, but there was a wave of anti-Chinese violence, really frightening, as you know, at the end of the 1990s. And so many students were sent abroad, many Chinese Indonesian students were sent abroad. And so for a while it was almost entirely Chinese Indonesian students who were coming to Foothill College. Now we still have a very large Indonesian population at Foothill of international students, and of course local students of Indonesian descent. But it's much more mixed than it was at that time. So even the immigration history of Foothill College, in particular, is linked to these ongoing waves of violence that have engulfed the nation of Indonesia from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Chris, thank you for that. And also, I'll just add that, you know, not very, like quite recently, scholars, activists who are wanting to really highlight this piece of history and achieve some kind of justice were still getting silenced in Indonesia. So in a way, as much, you know, me being here in the US also actually provides some protection for me, because I am, you know, kind of outside of that, especially now having been naturalized an American citizen. So it's funny to, you know, it's just interesting to think of the multiple layers of complexities of being, you know, Indonesian and Indonesian.
Sorry, could I ask a question? I was wondering, I read your paper on the act of killing.
Oh, you did? Thank you.
And it was quite interesting to see your perspective, especially from the fact that you mentioned that the ending of the film might have been forced by the director in some way. Not forced, but kind of guided, you know. And I was just hoping to get your opinion on the film a little more and see how it reflects Indonesian history, because it was a big splash in the West, and it was kind of the only representation we ever had of Indonesia in general. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for reading the article. So Pavel mentioned this movie called The Act of Killing, which was by Joshua Oppenheimer in 2012? Am I right? 2012? Yes, okay. Thank you, Chris. So for those of you who don't know, you can click on the link there in the chat box, the Wikipedia page. But it's like a documentary, but experimental documentary with very surreal and very graphic scenes, in which Joshua Oppenheimer, the director, actually focuses on the perspective of the thugs, the murderers who were responsible for some of the killings that happened during 1965. You know, that history that I mentioned, the anti-communist killings. So this film by Joshua Oppenheimer was very controversial for the fact that it was focused on the perspective of the murderers. So it's a very interesting, very fascinating movie. And Pavel mentions the end of the film, which is a scene in which we see one of the murderers, actually, so this is the end of the film. So we see kind of an arc, right? We see kind of the psychological the murderer coming to terms with what he has done in his past. And so the ending scene is this murderer like kind of retching, like almost vomiting. So it's a pretty, you know, it's an ugly scene to watch. But so I think it's up for debate, Pavel. I'm not sure I have the answer to that, because it is a film, right? And you have cameras behind you. You have, you know, that there's some kind of, you can think of it as a performance, or is it really real that he's haunted by the ghosts of his past, right? So I think it's up for debate, and I'm not sure I have the answer to that. It's a difficult scene to watch, and you can read into it, I think, in different ways. So, you know, I don't think I have a definite answer for you, but I think it is up for debate, and that's why the movie is controversial, exactly for these reasons, right? And that's why you have these questions. And then for anyone who's interested, the sequel to that, and I don't know if you've seen the sequence, Pavel, but The Look of Silence is focused actually on the families of the survivors. Sorry, the families of the victims, so the survivors, the surviving families. So, and that one is a really well done film too. But, you know, I am of two minds about The Act of Killing. One, which is that there have been movies made about 1965 by local filmmakers in Indonesia, but they just haven't gotten the circulation or distribution, right? So it's not internationally accessible. And two, I think some of the representation of Indonesians in The Act of Killing is quite grotesque, and in a way that feeds into the narrative of, okay, so this is a backward country, right, full of thugs. So for people who don't know the history, it may be challenging in that sense. And then the third layer is the good thing to come out of this movie is that it did highlight that history, because Joshua Oppenheimer was able to make a high production film that was circulated widely, and he also made available BitTorrent links so that people can share the film via kind of more underground means. And he had, underground screenings of the film in Indonesia. So he really did make the film travel widely. And that's one of the great things to have come out of his work.
And it makes an interesting point of contrast to Kelly Loves Tony, which was, as you emphasize in your article, perhaps as deeply rooted as any film that's ever been made in the community itself. I mean, literally made by the participants in this completely fascinating way, is really different than having some European director fly in with all of their money and all their power and et cetera, to make the film. And then, as you know, that's a big theme in Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer as well, when he confronts sort of the fictional equivalent of the famous Hollywood director who made Apocalypse Now, who's from San Francisco. So there we go. All right, but back to you, Viola.
All right, so I am actually going to skip over a few slides because I'm watching the time, and I do want to give enough time for questions so I can cover some of what's in the slides maybe during a discussion, like a more discussion format, so I don't keep talking at you. But so some of the things I wanted to highlight just before I end this, before I end sharing my screen is one, Kelly Loves Tony's use of sort of this DIY technology is something that I think is significant to point out. And this is a quote from a South Asian American scholar, Vivek Bald, who wrote a book called Bengali Harlem. He also is an independent filmmaker, but he says, this DIY approach to technology has always existed in poor communities, being able to use technology in very innovative ways. And okay, so the last couple of things I just want to point out is the significance of the use of the camcorder. So for those of you who read the article, I kind of talk about this a little bit, but A.K. Don Bonus and Kelly Loves Tony were made with analog camcorders right at the cusp of when the first digital camcorder came out. So for me, like the fact that it was made using these analog camcorders right before the first digital camcorder came out is, I think, a really significant piece of media history. And I think, when I've taught this movie several times, a lot of students comment on how these films like Kelly Loves Tony and also A.K. Don Bonus, that's A.K. Don Bonus on the top, but it's a predecessor to vlogging, like the current use of social media for self-documentation. And so I've got this screenshot here below of Tony. So, I think to link this use of analog camcorder to the current, digital media used for vlogging, for documenting your lives, I think it's a really interesting connection to make. And so, and then the last thing I'll just say is something that is the focus, like the heart of the article, which is about community, about care, and about love. So I actually interviewed Spencer Nakasako about Kelly Loves Tony, in advance of this article. And I discovered that, he really did spend time, 17 years, with this youth, right? With these kids, teenagers that are just coming up in the world. So this trilogy, including Kelly Loves Tony, are films that I argue in the article that are really about what it means to make films about community and with community, while at the same time being careful with the people that careful with the people that you work with. And one of the things that I like to point out is the use of amateur technology. And I'll just end on this point, is that the use of the amateur use of video cameras, of video making, filmmaking, comes from the very word, the amateur to love, or the lover, amateur. So my argument is that it's very much based on this, like not amateur as in unskilled or poorly skilled, but amateur as in doing something with love. So I'll just open it up for discussion here, so we have enough time for people to to ask questions or comments.
So like in terms of like the modern day like Indonesian film industry, it seems to be dominated a lot more by the foreign films, like a lot of like American and Korean films. Um, like do you think there's still like a lot of room for um like local kind of filmmaking that is like by Indonesians, like for Indonesians, kind of like what Spencer Nakasako kind of did with his chronicling of the like of Kelly Loves Tony?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think Edward Gunawan, if he's here, can also speak to that. But so Chris's question is specifically focused on Indonesian filmmaking, right? So this may be outside the purview of a lot of people here, but Indonesia at the moment, I think, is going through a very, very exciting moment in filmmaking. There's a lot of great filmmakers doing really innovative stuff. In fact, a few months ago, I just saw this film called um, I'm sorry, this is escaping me now, but it was screened at the American Film AFI Film Festival. So it's, you know, there's like I think a rising group of new filmmakers, very exciting filmmakers that um, that points to a new maybe wave of Indonesian filmmaking. And as far as you say that there's a lot of like foreign films being watched in Indonesia. I think one of the things that is interesting that I see happening is collaboration across countries. So I know that I hear that a lot of Japanese companies are collaborating with Indonesian film companies, produce films. So that's, I mean, I think that's exciting too. And that, in relation to Kelly Loves Tony, is something that I value, which is the inter-Asian, inter-ethnic collaboration, which is that, hey, it can be possible for a Japanese American filmmaker who's of a different background, different class, to collaborate and work on something together with somebody who is Southeast Asian, who is not Japanese American, but so you have this possibility for across different racial and ethnic lines.
Thank you.
And I'll jump in and say this is very basic. We mentioned it in Samina Ali's presentation because she was talking about the global Muslim diaspora, but I mentioned it because I didn't know this until I traveled to Indonesia myself. It's the fourth largest nation by population on the planet. It's also, in terms of its geographical extent, one of the largest nations. So China is first, India is second, the United States is third, and right behind the United States in terms of total population is Indonesia. And the vast majority of Indonesians, although not all Indonesians, the vast majority of Indonesians are Muslims. So the largest Muslim country by population by far is Indonesia as well. And it's just not on many Americans' radar, even though the presence of American corporations and the presence of American media and the presence of American money and power and military all the way back to the Cold War era is very palpable when you're there. But on the other side, many Americans, including myself until I was able to travel there, it's just not, I remember it sort of not being on my radar. So that's why I'm fond of quoting those facts, right? Because I think it was sure news to me that it was the fourth most populous nation on the planet. I had no idea. And I had no idea that it was the largest Muslim nation on the planet too. And then so much more that I learned while I was there. More questions?
I wanted to ask a little bit about, first of all, it's very exciting to see someone who studies film. Yay, it's great. I wanted to ask a little bit about your English perspective and how you sort of did your bachelor's and master's in English, and now you find yourself studying film. And also it's very interesting because most of the courses, for example, that I've taken were also in English, but writing articles on film is a very interesting process, which includes, many of the formal elements as well. So I was wondering about your process, and especially now being in USC, which is kind of a, legendary for film. What do you think about that?
Thanks for the question, Pavel. So you're interested in film, obviously, right? I actually did it. So and Scott, I think you can speak to this too. Literature and film are actually two fields that are very, very closely related.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I guess it depends on the institution, but a lot of film scholars are also housed in English departments, are also teaching in English departments. You have film courses within English departments. Depending on the institution, sometimes they're separate, but a lot of times they are within the same department. So I think the history of that, I think they came out of the same kind of field, literature and film, literary studies and film studies.
Yeah, and I'll jump in because it's not a bad time to say your degree is in American Studies, which is not a field that everyone, or I hope I'm getting that right, but I mean, there's something called American Studies that many students aren't aware of, and it's kind of a variation on English, but American Studies we look at all forms of communication. So we're definitely looking at American literature in terms of print, but we look at film and we look at advertising and we look at social discourse and we look at, it's sort of like the whole cultural ball of yarn, of which literature is just one very large and important strand. And then also that the critical lenses that are applied, you could see that in Viola's piece. So she's quoting Edward Said, who's one of the founders of post-colonial theory, and his incredible breakthrough book, Orientalism. You're using various tools. The definition of amateurism that you put forth quite appropriately. These are all drawing on literary critical theory, which can then be applied to almost anything. It can be applied to advertising. It can be applied to social media. It can be applied to film. It can be applied to independent film. It can be applied to Zoom chats, by the way. That'll be an interesting new emerging field, I think, because now suddenly the whole world is on Zoom.
Yeah.
Andrea.
Sorry, I'll just finish with this last thought in response to Pavel's question, since you asked about how my process was. So I remember when I was in one of the classes that I took during my master's coursework was film noir. And we actually not only watched film noir, but we read the books that a lot of these films were adapted from, right? So we had a class based on, kind of book to film adaptations and things like that. And I think one of the common threads is this thread, language, right? I've always been interested in language. And so in literature, you have this, attention to language, to what is literary. The same way in film, it's more visual, but it's a different form of language. But so you can think about the different kinds of languages across two different mediums. So that's one way that I always like to think about it, is that these are different kinds of languages, but one is literary language, but one is also, kind of filmic based. So there are, I will try to get to answer the questions on the chat, but Juban, do you want to go?
No, Andrea.
Andrea's next.
Andrea, okay.
Hi. Hi. Before I ask my question, I was wondering if you've seen Parasite, because my question's kind of like along the lines of that. Okay, great. So my question is, I feel like, as we were talking about earlier with Crazy Rich Asians and like the, I guess like the boom in Asian film, with the movies like Crazy Rich Asians and Parasite, I feel like a lot of its success depended on like the relatability that the audience, like they could see themselves like in this family, like they identified themselves with like a specific person. And I was wondering if you think that because I'm not a huge like movie person, I feel like a lot of the movies I watch is dependent on like word of mouth or like what's recommended for me like in my queue on Netflix. Do you think that for, I would like to say a minority group such as like Asians or African Americans or whatever, I think, do you think it's important for relatability to be the number one factor in determining a film's success when it comes to movies like that? Like, for example, I feel like when people are watching like these blockbusters, like Marvel movies, like obviously no one's watching it because they feel like they can empathize with the characters. But I feel like when it comes to like Asian movies specifically, like you want to watch it because you're like, oh, maybe like my family's like that, or like I can relate. And I want to know like if you think that when making a movie as a minority director catering to a minority audience, if like you need to rely on reliability, or do you think that like success can come just from content or just from storyline?
Yeah, that's a great question. makes me think of so many things and so many different movies. I think one of the things that your question made me think about is, so you mentioned Marvel too, right?
Yeah.
And I'm a fan of Marvel movies too. I think they're really great. And I think there's, like with Marvel, right, it's superheroes. So
Right.
I think there's a way in which we, as people, we also crave for movies that show us a different reality, like imagine different kinds of worlds. As much as I think movies like, say, The Farewell, if you've seen The Farewell, starring Awkwafina, that was a movie after Crazy Rich Asians.
Okay.
The next kind of.
Oh wait, is that the one with her grandmother? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so like The Farewell, for instance, when I screen that film, my students say, and these are not just Asian American students or Asian students who will make this comment, is that, oh, it reminds me of my grandmother, or it reminds me of my own family, right? So I think the part that is relatable may not even just be specifically based on like race or ethnicity. It can the kinds of topics that a movie is about, right? And I think, so I think it's important to have that as kind of the, one of the things to consider, which is that you can identify with a movie, even if it's not your own kind of specific ethnicity. And also, you know, as you were talking, I'm reminded of this movie I just saw recently. I bought it on Amazon Prime. It kind of went under the radar, I think, but it's a beautiful film, Queen and Slim. Have you seen that? So good, right? So, you know, thinking about like different ethnicities and representation in film and media, I would say like films like, so like Queen and Slim, the way that it's made, it's very poetic. It's not kind of a readily kind of the mainstream. This is just your regular African-American representation. This is what, you know, the regular Black people are like. But, you know, just as I said, like with Marvel, with any kind of movie, I think we also like to have different representations of realities, of worlds. So there's not like one way, right, that you can relate to.
Sure, but I think like what I'm asking you is like, because those movies are very relatable to like Asians specifically, because that's who's in the movie, do you think that like anytime soon we can see like a boom in filmmakers who do not rely on relatability to tell a story?
Yeah, I think, you know, it also had, so Crazy-ish Asians, I'm not sure if everyone can relate to that, because it's a certain demographics, right? But it is also something that most people, if they see it, you know, what I've seen in terms of like people's responses is that they love it. Like it's just nice to see yourself represented on the screen, right? I mean, for the first time ever, it's all Asian. So there's something kind of transformative seeing yourself in the big screen. So definitely something to be said about that. I wonder if other people have thoughts too about these questions.
Well, I'm going to just jump in and say one of the things that I thought was wonderful about the film that you chose that I had not seen, although it does remind me of Wayne Wang's early breakthrough film, 1985 Dim Sum, A Little Bit of Heart, was that, and it was, you so emphasized that relatable or not relatable, like who makes the film? And that's where that camera was, so that camcorder made it possible for local community members to make their own film on a low budget. And really prior to that, I mean, you're the TikTok, I call you the TikTok generation, but the fact that you can all upload constantly videos, you constantly make your own videos, and you take that for granted, which is great. But the democratizing effect of that technology, this was definitely kind of the moment, and it wasn't even digital yet, but that fact that you could put a camera in the hands of these two young teenagers, and who then become highly relatable, right? Including that, you know, Kelly, if you haven't seen the film, better, like students, like if you skipped it, you better get back in there. Like the main character, the person profiled is a community college student at Laney Community College, right? And she's so much like the students that I encounter every day, because she is the students that I encounter every day. And so the fact that it's a Bay Area film, that it's a community college student that's part of this whole thing. And really the Myanmar, the Cambodian, the Vietnamese, and other communities, they're still right there in the same, you know, like a lot of the main epicenters and demographic areas are exactly the same as they were in 1998. It really hasn't, those things have not shifted. East Bay, Tenderloin, etc. Those are still areas with very high immigrant or second gen populations, low income, who don't always fit the sort of model minority status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Scott. And also, I think, you know, Foothill College being where it is, right, Los Altos, right in the heart of kind of Silicon Valley, it's also good to be reminded that there are these regional, like Bay Area ethnic communities, and what they go through, but also the similarities, right? You go through high school graduation, you overcome, you know, you want successes in life, you still go through, experience the same things, but still highlighting these different Bay Area regional ethnic enclaves.
Jonah, go ahead.
Hello.
Hi, Jonah.
My question is, do you think social media platforms, I mean, building off of what Scott said of the TikTok generation, do you think that social media platforms and influencers today could be just as effective as independent filmmakers to cross-cultural borders, expose Western populations to Asian values and lifestyle, dispel common racial stereotypes, etc.?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a very influential medium. You can do a lot of, it's very powerful. And TikTok, in fact, is something, like I signed up for TikTok maybe a couple of months ago just to follow what my niece is doing. And I got, you know, there was one day I got sucked into this rabbit hole of TikTok, and I was just so amazed. You know, I find the whole like mimetic, like repetitive element of TikTok really fascinating. But, you know, it's also a medium in which someone like my niece who's living in Indonesia is doing the same thing that someone like maybe you are doing here in the US, right? So that's the kind of the power of social media, the power of internet technology. So absolutely, independent filmmaking. And also, if you think about independent filmmaking, a lot of times you have to work with constraints. And I think if you think about using the cell phone, using certain technologies that have limitations and what you can do creatively with it, you know, that's really powerful, while having the power of the internet, being able to make your work accessible and be distributed through so many different channels.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in one more time just to say that since you're mentioning that your niece is in Indonesia, and there's also been there's been so many breakthrough films that have come from overseas, including Indonesia, let's say, that Americans again haven't always been aware of. I mean, like as a queer person, I remember vividly when a film came out of Taiwan in the early '90s called Crystal Boys, that was based on a novel that had come out again in Taiwan, and it was a breakthrough piece of cinema for the whole gay community. And it can kind of just keep going on with this litany. And Edward Ganawan, who's in the chat room with us now, former Foothill student, made a whole number of breakthrough films. Once again, many of them highlighting queer experience in Indonesia, which was both a brave and a fantastic thing to do. So oftentimes it's the filmmakers who are not in the United States who are doing path-breaking civil rights work. And Parasite's kind of an interest, you know, Parasite, I'm so glad it won, but it's the first time ever in the history of the Academy Awards that a non-US film is winning Best Picture. And that's way overdue in terms of like the impact of filmmakers around the world.
I would just add one thing though. I grew up in Southern California, and one of my good friends' father was a casting agency. But anyways, the problem with the stories that are not being made in America is because there is no financing, and there is not an accident that after Joy Luck Club there was not much until Crazy Rich Asians. But I think that it's because there's no financing, and if China or other countries are financing movies, they want their best side, the best foot forward to be placed. And I was actually really surprised how much financing Korea gave to Parasite and other movies that depict negatively their society. And I think Asian cultures always want to put their best foot forward. And so financing those types of movies or controversial things like Kelly Loves Tony, it's just there's not going to be a lot of funding for it.
Absolutely. I'll just can I just echo you, Juban? You know, aside from the merits of Bong Joon-ho's filmmaking, you know, skills and talent, you also have to be aware of how much funding went into that movie. Like, it's crazy, the campaigning and marketing. Same thing with a movie like Roma too, if you remember Roma. You know, basically, I think it was, so because it was a Netflix movie, right? So Netflix, I heard something like Netflix actually bought the whole like company that does the marketing so that they can aggressively campaign to the point where it becomes an Oscar contender. So a lot of this is also has to do with the economics of it, right? The capital behind it. So, and
yeah, but I also think that, and this is the last one, but you have to look at a company like Netflix. Where is it based of? Silicon Valley, who are in the senior management. They're very ethnically diverse. So that's why you have them, you know, making movies like Roma, or also Mindy Kaling just did this new 10-part episode. I saw a pilot of it, somebody sent me. So I think that it's being diversified. So even if some of us are not going to go into film and making sure that we fund some of those things with our dollars, because I think those stories need to be made and said. And I'm pretty sure Edward could attest to that as a filmmaker and what it takes to just make a film, and but also promoting it and other things.
yeah, I wonder if hey Edward, would you like to jump in? I mean, you're also another Foothill alum and filmmaker. I don't know if you want to jump in, or I can. There are a bunch of questions here that haven't been addressed.
Yeah, Jonah's next, but I just kind of, since we're on the film, I just wanted Edward to join, you know, as a filmmaker.
Hey.
Good to see you.
Yeah, so I've been following the conversation. Great job, Viola. And yeah, there are a couple of things that I've been kind of noting as we went along. I want to talk about a little bit about the relatability that somebody asked earlier. Andrea, I think you did ask that. I feel like that is a matter of representation. You know, I think we, as creators or producers of content, sometimes, yeah, I think we do get boxed into what kind of representation that we can tell. And I think, as Juban has said earlier, I think a lot of it has to do with resources. And so especially like a film is a huge collaborative project that costs quite a bit of money. And so what kind of characters get represented on screen, yeah, it becomes a commercial kind of factor. And what Viola was saying earlier about social media, I think that is like the democratization of content producing and creating. And as a queer person myself too, a queer person of color, it is very encouraging to see more representation. And it may not be like all the most positive, let's say, you know, even in social media influencing, for example. But it is very encouraging to see different kind of representation out there. And so somebody who is, like, you know, Viola mentioned earlier, your niece doing things on social media, I can also see like somebody who is like queer in a third world country that doesn't have a lot of like representation of that. To see those representation on social media is very empowering and very powerful. And I think I also want to talk about the Oscar campaign and stuff. One of my film actually is, actually 2 films that I produced was selected by the country in Thailand to for the Oscar foreign film, best foreign film category. And yeah, let me tell you, it is really, really expensive to mount a campaign. We couldn't afford it. We're independent filmmakers. Just to give you an idea, one of the requirements when you do a campaign is to have this academy screening, and it's actually a lot of money to even like host one screening for the academy members to attend, to watch the film. And I think that's your prerequisite, because if nobody watched the film, then nobody votes on it. And so that's like a lot of layers actually to get there. So I think we only did one screening, very pathetic. But yeah, I mean, that shows like, it's not just like, oh, you get like, you know, you qualify for this, but then to actually do a campaign and to have a formidable campaign, to be really in the race, you know. So that was one thing that I learned from doing it. And I thought that, you know, I think me coming from an independent background, I was like, oh, I made my film and, you know, it's great. You know, we qualified and then like the path will open up. It's like, it's actually not like that at all, you know. And I'm not saying it to discourage people, but I think it is a reality of the industry, you know. And I think like film, like, and even in publishing or other kind of businesses, it's an industry. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick follow-up, just because we're like on this topic already?
Sure, yeah.
I was wondering, like, do you think then that because, like I said, a majority of popular or like trending movies are coming from word of mouth, do you think like platforms such as like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon should be doing more to promote like independent filmmakers or just any type of movie that was created by like a minority director or something along those lines? Or do you think it's just solely reliant on like the director and like the people who created the movie to promote their own things?
I think it is both, and I see that the streaming services has done a lot actually to promote, to find, to cultivate different voices, different representation. So I think yes, there's the responsibility of the creators, the directors, the writers, and then the streaming services or like the studios to make these films. But I think there's also the second part of responsibility from the audience to seek out these things, right? Because you know, the creators could make these films, create this content, but if nobody's watching it or wanting to watch it, then I think it's very hard for them to justify, you know, somebody throwing resources for it. For example, yesterday I just found, it's actually been on my list, but I haven't watched it for a long time. I couldn't delay watching it. There's this documentary on Netflix called All in My Family about a Chinese person, Chinese queer person in America, going back to China and like coming out basically, and then having a baby with his partner, 2 babies actually with his partner. It was really moving. I actually cried, I would say. But like, you know, like it's there, it's on Netflix, but for a long time, you know, it's just on my queue. I didn't watch it, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that's coming back to my responsibility. Like, yeah, this person actually made the film already. Netflix actually carried.
Like just a quick like comment.
Such a long time to actually go do it. Anyway.
For sure, just like a quick comment, like what Ju Bean said earlier, I kind of disagree on what he said when he said like there's no available funding. I think the funding is there. I think it's just like a lack of trust, I guess you can say, to give it to like an unknown or like someone who probably doesn't have like much experience in making these movies. So I don't think it's necessarily like a lack of funding that's the problem. I think it's a lack of just trust and willing to trust someone to convey whatever story they want to convey.
I agree, and I think I've taken a lot of time already, but I will say this, that yeah, I think that's why the social media is such a powerful tool, as Viola said earlier, because I think it really does democratize the process, allows more different representation at least. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll jump in because I know that some students do have to leave, which is, I've said before, you all know it's okay if you have to go off to another class. Officially my class, which is part of the audience, only about half. We've got 42 people in here, so it's not all my students. Viola, we can keep going as long as you have time for. You might have a life and a class yourself, so I kind of leave it up to you to how many more questions you would like to take. But I think we have plenty of people who are willing to ask if you're able to stay online for a while longer. So what are you thinking about that?
I don't have a meeting until 1 o'clock, so I'm good till then.
Okay, well, that's great. So let's keep taking some questions, and I'll let my my co-host decide who's queued up next.
Disha, go ahead.
Hi, Viola. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I had a question specifically about how you kind of personally and professionally through your writing push back on Asian stereotypes, such as the model minority stereotype, and like what are the kind of pitfalls of a stereotype like the model minority stereotype, which is like, it's kind of painting Asians as like a, just people who succeed in America and actually achieve the American dream. And what do you think are the negative consequences of such a stereotype?
Thanks for the question, Disha. So the first part of your question was, how do I write against these kinds of stereotypes?
Yeah, like how do you use your work or your writing to best push against these type of stereotypes?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'm not a creative writer, so I don't write like novels or fiction or poetry, but I write a lot of academic work, and I teach. So for me, what goes on in the classroom is really important to me, and so that's why, like with this journal, for instance, as an example, like Film Quarterly Journal, special issue on Asian American film and media, I knew that I wanted to write about underrepresented communities in Asian American studies. So the Southeast Asian, not just Southeast Asian Americans, which have traditionally been kind of underrepresented and excluded from the main discourse around Asian American experience and studies. It's kind of like the stepchild of Asian American studies, like Southeast Asian Americans, because the focus has been traditionally East Asian. So in my teaching and my writing too, I try to highlight those stories and narratives. And I think we are seeing a very, very exciting moment in Asian American literature where we are seeing a surge in a lot of really exciting writers, ranging from like queer voices. So like Alexander Chee has a great book, just came out. And then we have a number of stories coming out of like the Hmong American community, Hmong American refugee writers, but also like Cambodian, right? So we have now like a very exciting moment in the literary world as far as the writers go. And so as a way to answer your question, so that's how I kind of try to make sure that students are getting like a range of, and understand that the Asian American experience is very diverse and there's a range of it, right? And that it's really important to highlight those stories that have been traditionally left out of history, not just Asian American history, but also American history. And then as far as the second part of your question, which is what are the most insidious things that can happen, the harmful effects of the model minority? Well, one is that it's just like an impossible thing, right? You just have to constantly be up against this stereotype, but also the most important part of this, the myth, is that this, the model minority myth was created as a political means to really, as a way for the state, for the government to pit different races against each other. And so the African American community is the community that's most harmed by this. So in the post World War II era, so you have Japanese Americans, right, who fought for the war, who fought for the US. But then after the war, these same Japanese Americans were then interned at the internment camps because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So there was a wave of racism against Japanese Americans who were then incarcerated. And so during this era, kind of this civil rights movement, right? You have this very tumultuous period in the 60s with civil rights movement. What happened was that, the model minority myth was created to give access to, Asian American students who then managed to succeed in college, while at the same time saying, why can't the African American community do the same, right? And so it's these kinds of impossible barriers that are put in place. So it's a political means strategy to pit one race and ethnicity against one another, and it's something that is just kind of factually and historically not accurate too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, hello, Viola. You talked a lot about how Kelly Loves Tony seems so modern, as a lot of the same things apply today. Has there been much progress in institutions helping Asian American immigrants since then?
Yeah, I think, let's see, progress in institutions helping Asian American immigrants. Maybe in terms of specifically the refugee community. I mean, there are human rights lawyers and activists fighting for the rights of refugees, but I think the barrier, the challenge that they come up against is the government, right, with the administration. So what do you do when you face when you get deported, and how it's a long battle. And I don't know, Scott, if you can add to this, but because we are seeing that people have been getting deported, I think it's a very sticky situation.
Yeah, I was actually terrified that Tony would be deported, because as you said early on in the talk, I mean, I think he would be now. Mm-hmm. And so this kind of happy ending or semi-happy ending that occurs is less possible, I think, tragically, although I think the same East Asian Community Center is still there and still doing fantastic work. And I bet some of those same lawyers that helped Kelly and Tony are still working in the community. I mean, the legal community in the Bay Area in terms of supporting immigrants have been amazing nationally as well. And I should add, and Viola knows this because she studies Asian American literature, but there's a long, long tradition of Chinese immigrants in particular and Japanese immigrants pushing back against the state when these periods of real oppression come in, and using the legal system in ways that benefit everyone. They benefit queer people like me. They've benefited the African American community. Many of the original legal battles were fought around Asian American civil rights, and then could be applied. And I don't mean exclusively, of course, but far more than many people realize, a lot of the original legal battles were around civil rights for Asian Americans. And then those court cases were used as part of the landmark defenses in, say, Brown versus Board of Education and other better known decisions. And that's to take nothing away from the civil rights leaders in other communities, but the Asian American community doesn't always get the credit for how long, for how many decades, over a century of American law, civil rights law, often pivots on cases brought by Japanese or Chinese Americans here in the United States.
Has there been any progress in stereotypes from the time of Kelly Loves Tony to now, or has it increased or decreased, or what has changed?
That's an interesting question to think about now, I think, with and now kind of taking it beyond this Southeast Asian American youth. But thinking more broadly about the current moment, COVID-19, this pandemic, and the anti-Asian, not just anti-Chinese racism, but anti-Asian, because it gets conflated, right? You look a certain way and you get bracketed and boxed in a certain way. So I think in terms of stereotypes in relation to Asian Americans, I think, so let me just kind of backtrack, and I'm reminded of this case. This is worth looking up and worth you finding out more about, is the case of Vincent Chin, who he was a Chinese American man just about to get married. He lived in Detroit, Michigan. He was killed in 1982, and he was killed by these two men very brutally with a baseball bat. But he was actually mistaken for Japanese American. And this was during a time when the auto industry in Detroit, Michigan, so, you know, Detroit, Michigan had car plant companies like Ford, right? And the unemployment rate was really at a low because of the different needs for cars and the rising costs in oil at the time. And so Japanese cars were being imported, and that fit what the American people needed at the time. And so there was this wave of like anti-Japaneseness, anti-Japanese sentiment, racist sentiment, because they thought, oh, Japanese car companies are taking away our jobs. So this case of Vincent Chin, he was murdered because he was mistaken for Japanese. And so I was just thinking that, you know, this kind of anti-Chinese rhetoric, you know, calling, you know, with you have a president who calls this crisis the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, you know, so kind of fueling that kind of racist sentiment. But then I think that that then gets applied to the stereotype of being an Asian or Asian American. You know, you're kind of there. It feels like like we have not developed at all from or improved, right? It feels like that because of the crazy, unbelievable rhetoric. So to backtrack even further, in the late 19th century, you know, the very first major immigration ban that the United States had was the Chinese Exclusion Act, so which barred Chinese citizens from coming into the US. And during this time, there was a lot of cartoons drawn that depicted Chinese people as like dirty and bringing diseases into the country, right? So this was kind of the image, the racist image. And I think, so from the late 19th century, then now connecting it to now, there's that connection, right? Racist connection that Asian people, specifically Chinese, they bring diseases. So I think, you know, in a way, we are still in that moment because of the kind of the rhetoric that is being thrown around.
Thank you.
What's next?
Hi. Thanks for answering my first question, by the way, with the recommendations. I had a second question, actually, and it might be a callback to what we were talking about before with the Academy and award season. So I'm sure you know how Parasite won a bunch of Academy Awards, like Bong Joon-ho won Best Director, Parasite got Best Picture, it also won the Palme d'Or, amongst other stuff. But The Farewell didn't really get any awards. And I found that interesting because I remember reading this one article a while back about how Kendrick Lamar won the Pulitzer Prize. And it was talking about whether Kendrick needed the Pulitzer or did the Pulitzer Awards need Kendrick Lamar? And I have the same question for you. So does the Academy need Parasite or does Parasite need the Academy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure that, you know, people here in the room, they're remaining here in the room, I think you all probably have very good answers to this too. It's a really good question. I think, remember what Bong Joon-ho said about the Oscars, which is that, you know, it's a very local is actually very local, because if you look at the range of movies that are being honored at the Oscars, it's actually a lot of it is like Hollywood, right? And there's only like a very small categories dedicated, and there's not even screen time given to like films that are outside of the purview of like the mainstream Hollywood. So I mean, in a way, if I were to choose one, it would be the Academy needs Parasite. I think that would be my instinct if I were to choose one, right? At the same time, I think there's no like one definite answer to that, but I think thinking about Bong Joon-ho's comment about how the Oscars is such a local thing actually makes me think, you know, the Academy Awards in the wake of, say, the Me Too movement, also the Oscar So White movement, right? The Oscar So White, I think it is the right moment for them to have the winner be Parasite, right? Something non-English, something non-American, but then it's still like very high production value, really well made. So that's my response to that. And your first question was, the first part was?
It was about the recommendations.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I think you answered it in the chat already. Yeah, but I didn't know that he said that actually, that the Oscars are a very local thing, which is true, because I don't think a lot of people realize, but it's not like it's not just a sit down meeting with a few people that decide who wins the Oscars. Like there's an entire expensive campaign that goes behind winning an Oscar, and like sending free gifts to these voters, sending like free copies of your movies, taking them to screening. So it's really it's a popularity contest, and you know, it's great that Parasite won, because it's really indicative of where we're going next with the Oscars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot of films that I think that I felt like could have gotten better reception or a wider, you know, acclaim. Like, so it really makes you wonder, right? So what makes a movie be Oscar worthy? Like, what does it take? Because I was thinking of films like, you know, even like, I mentioned Queen and Slim. So this is what made me think when I watched the Oscars, this last one, I thought, you know what, in the end, it is still Oscar So White, because all of these other movies that have been made, you know, even like Dolomite Is My Name is actually, I think it was really good, came out on Netflix, but wasn't nominated for any awards. Queen and Slim also never got any nods. So there are a bunch of other films that makes you wonder, right? It's like, so is Parasite the one that's going to kind of cover the ground for diversity, right?
Yeah, that was a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Saba. And you know, on that note, like with your first question, I think Netflix probably also, I don't know if it has to do with the pandemic, but I think Netflix has a lot of coming out with a lot of really really cool movies on a global scale, because everyone is just sheltering at home, and so I think there's a need for that.
There's a lot of time to watch these movies.
So Shanisa has a question. What are Kelly and Tony up to now? Did Kelly get the education she wanted? She had to head out, but the host could possibly ask this question.
Okay, great. Oh, I'm sorry, Shanisa had to leave, but Jamie, you've waved your hand, so I don't know if you want.
I do have a question still.
Shanisa's question, or should I?
My question is kind of about Kelly Loves Tony, and I really wanted to learn more about the amateur like photography approach that you wrote about, because my question kind of goes back to like the relatability question Andrea had, and I was really intrigued by her perspective on it, because personally I feel like narratives, stories, films allow the space for them to be relatable, because a lot of the time mainstream media isn't relatable to people of color. So I feel like personal narratives give that space for us to just express ourselves, and it's going to cling to whoever it clings to, especially for that audience, for the people that are in a way silenced because they're not seeing their representation on multimedia. But that's just my opinion on that. But my question is, would you say the amateur approach to the filmmaking in Kelly Loves Tony reflect an ethical way of producing a film about a community's history?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually one of the most important questions that I was thinking about when I interviewed Spencer Nakasako, and when I was thinking about using this term, right? And I even asked the editors, can I change the title, because I don't want people to just see the title and think that I'm saying that the film is amateur in kind of a not in a great way, right? But let me answer first the question by Shanisa, and then I'll transition to answering that question. So actually, my students were the ones who told me about this. They said, okay, they looked them up. They got so invested in both Kelly and Tony. So they sent me this article, and so they're actually separated. They no longer are with each other. The kids are grown up. So you can actually find this online somewhere. There's an article, I believe it's an article on CAM Media, CAAM Media, I think, Center for Asian American Media. Great. I love this kind of live DJ thing. Yeah, so you can find that out there. And actually, Spencer Nakasako, when I was talking to him, he also told me that Kelly never finished college. It was just hard, and but she has a stable job. She has a stable job, so she is still working for whatever her goals in life. So that's where they are now. I think that this article has more on it. And then as far as the using this term amateur, I love this idea. Going back to the root word amateur, which comes from the root word amateur, which means lover. There's also, this theorist, Roland Barthes, who wrote about the amateur as somebody who loves and loves again. So I love this idea of like having a beginner's mind. Okay, so now I'm thinking about Ocean Vuong. Have you heard of the writer Ocean Vuong? So yeah, he just came out with his first novel. He's a poet, and he just came out with his first novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and I just taught that book last week. Beautiful, like super beautiful and heartbreaking novel. But I've seen interviews with him where he talks about having a beginner's mind, and how important that is, which is that you approach things with always like a curiosity, right? And I love that idea. And so the amateur is kind of similar to that, right? So my kind of thinking about the amateur is very much influenced by what Scott mentioned, which is in the article. So I cite this post-colonial theorist, Edward Said, who has a brief essay called Professionals and Amateurs. Okay. Actually, in this article, he was actually talking about the Vietnam War too, specifically, and said, instead of being so dogmatic, and instead of being so blindly like believing in what the government tells us of these communists, like the Red Scare, the communist threat, he actually in the article says we should approach things with a spirit of amateurism, which is that we are curious, and so we question things, like we question what the authorities tell us, right, what the state tell us. But also, he then says in the article, amateurism should be an activity that is fueled by care and by love, and by not by selfish reasons, but by your need for collaboration, for building bridges, basically. So I love that, and I think as far as Spencer Nakasako's films go, I think he did his absolute best in trying to make sure that the filmmaking was ethical and based on this kind of based on a very community-based collaboration. So he gave the camcorders to these teenagers, right? So they actually, instead of having like a very anthropologist like kind of documentation where you go into a community and you film them, right? And you have this detached perspective.
Right.
Kelly and Tony are filming these footages themselves. I mean, Spencer Nakasako edits the footages, but they're shooting their own scenes, right? And so I like that kind of self-documentation way of filmmaking that Spencer Nagasako allowed them to have, right? And one of the most important things too is he mentioned how he spent years and years with these teenagers, right? So I think part of the amateur like curiosity of motivation is also to understand that you can't just go in and work with people without putting in the time, without commitment, right? So that's one of the things that I really admire about the work, is that he really consciously put in like more than a decade's worth of making sure he got to know these people on a very human level.
Right. Thank you. That really thoroughly answers my question. And I feel that, I wonder, just to kind of like have a follow-up question, do you think it really helps that he made this documentary and he also is Asian American? Like, if he was white, like, would it have been perceived differently? Would, you know, like kind of that anthropology, kind of diving into a culture for your own entertainment? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so fascinating. I mean, that was one of the questions I asked him. I said, you being Japanese American, how was it working with these Southeast Asian refugee youth? So not just like a different ethnicity, but very different kind of background. Like, these were kids who had to go through violent war. Like, you know, A.K. Don Bonus, for instance, remembers one of his early memories being carried on his brother's backs through the jungle. And so these are people who lived through like a very violent past, right? So Spencer Nagasako, also being, he must be maybe second or at least third generation at this point, Japanese American. He said, absolutely. He said, you know, I was from a different class. By the time he was making these films with them, he already attained a certain level of comfort in his life, right? And so there's that. But I think even like whether it's white or another different Asian ethnicity, I think that kind of level of care still needs to be there. Yeah, I mean, I think if it's a white person, other than like rather than another Asian American, would make a difference. But I don't know. I think it depends on what that looks like. I think the motivations have to be, you know, I think that's
genuine.
Yeah.
Thank you for really explaining like Spencer's background and how he already had like a comfortable home, because being African American, I just feel like there's so many in a way types of every American, you know, and that's within each racial group. And I feel like class is the bigger barrier between like everything in America, because it doesn't really matter like what race you are. If you have money, then your experience is different, and your background, how you got here, how long you've been here, you know, every sacrifice you've made if you're first, second, third generation, and your education. Like, there's so many things that like really contribute to just your experience and like your lens altogether. So I really appreciate your explanation of basically what he was bringing to the table, but still there was that familiarity and like, I want to get to know me better, if anything, maybe from Spencer, like a part of him, like he feels he has to like learn more about through their story.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and a great response back. Like, that kind of intersectional perspective is definitely important, and doesn't mean that you're both Asian American, doesn't mean that there's that collaboration could happen on an ethical level, that oh yeah, that's, as long as you're both Asian Americans, then that's fine, right? And so that's why I think that his approach to interacting with them was the best scenario.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it might be an appropriate time to wrap up. What do you think? I think we got most of the questions taken care of. So I'll just say, because this is being recorded, I do my little ending here. This was part of the Foothill College Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month 2020. You can find links to Lasmana's article on our API Heritage Month website, foothill.edu, and then just search for API Heritage. You'll find also soon, within a couple of hours, you'll find links to the Zoom recording for this. And I'll just mention one more time that Andrew Lam is coming to us live from Saigon this coming Thursday, April 30th, for the 45th anniversary, and a very apt follow-up to this particular discussion about refugees from that large and still very significant war. So Viola, thank you so much for coming back to Foothill College. And we got to have you in person sometime soon. Maybe you can be like the graduation speaker. I've made that suggestion. So how about that someday? How about graduation speaker?
That would be a crazy honor.
Yeah, wouldn't that be fun? All right, well, we'll work on that. And thank you so much for being here. You don't have to leave, but I am going to go ahead and stop the recording. So that's the end of the recording. And